Well, welcome back to the Labour Party conference and time for the View, looking at the latest opinions and talking points from today's newspapers and news websites. And just to run through them quickly, Hugo Rifkin says that the panic for fuel and goods is down to a basic lack of trust in the government's capabilities to prevent empty shelves, petrol pumps and gas pipes. What's the next shortage? That's Gabby Hinsliff, somewhat cynically in The Guardian. She warns that more gaps may emerge in things once taken for granted by us. And panic buying turns into panic governing by the Prime Minister in today's cartoon in The Times, as he calls in the army, or does he? As the Prime Minister loses control, Sir Keir Starmer is getting a grip. That's according to Polly Toynbee, writing in The Guardian. She claims the government's incompetence is being felt around the country. But in the Daily Telegraph, Cheryl Jacobs disagrees. She writes that with the new winter of discontent looming, a credible opposition would have framed conference as Labour's big comeback, but instead the get-together has come across as a festival of insularity. The former Conservative Party leader, Lord Hague, William Hague, writes in The Times that Sir Keir should look to Germany as a centre-left blueprint for electoral success. Meanwhile, in The Eye, the Labour Party's former leader, Jeremy Corbyn, writes that people want massive social change, but the Labour leadership this week has shown it wants to prop up rather than challenge the wealth and power of the few. And finally, in Blair's cartoon in The Telegraph, the Labour conference appears to be a washout, but not Sir Keir, who is depicted here as the party's puppet master. Well, joining me today to look through those are Madeline Grant of the Daily Telegraph, assistant comment editor there and parliamentary sketchwriter, and Sonia Sodha, chief leader writer of The Observer, former senior advisor to Ed Miliband. Nice to see you both. So, Madam, we've got two conflicting views here. We've got Cheryl Jacobs on the one hand saying same old Labour, they're not going anywhere. Polly Toynbee actually thinking maybe it's coming together for Labour. What do you reckon?
Well, I'm obviously a bit biased here with Cheryl being my colleague, but I do think that she has slightly more the measure of how things are going, not least because since she wrote that piece, there's been even more infighting and events at the Labour conference itself, which seem to have gone a bit beyond Keir Starmer's control. You've had the resignation of one of his shadow cabinet, the fallout from Angela Rayner's remarks, and all sorts of factional infighting about things like party rules. And I think that Cheryl is perhaps more onto something when she says that there are all these massive crises going on in the country that Polly Toynbee talks about in her article, and yet the Labour Party haven't yet seemed to have stumbled on the right way to capitalise on those and kind of really ram the point home and lay it at the government's door. Instead, there has just been, I think, at conference, quite a lot of talking to itself.
I think there's an element of it was ever thus with party conferences, whether it's Labour or the Conservatives. I think these party conferences, apart from the big set-piece speeches that get played on the news that night, you know, clips of which will be clips of Keir Starmer speaking tomorrow will be on the news tomorrow. But I think apart from that, they tend to be quite inwardly focused affairs.
Yeah, but there is always this question as to whether the mood of the conference is with the leadership or not. What's your reading of it?
So my reading of it is there's quite a lot of ambivalence. So I think people think that the party is in, a lot of people think the party is in a better place than it was under Jeremy Corbyn. So I think there's a recognition of progress, but I also think that there isn't like levels of mass enthusiasm in the party for Keir Starmer's leadership would probably be my sense of it, so kind of somewhere in between. I think one of the tricky things that Labour's got at the moment, so I can see what Cheryl Jacobs is saying in her column about there's all this stuff going wrong in the country and Labour aren't in charge of the narrative. The issue is, I think, it's quite hard for Labour to get heard at this stage of a parliament when you're kind of 3 years out of an election. People generally people aren't that interested in politics anyway, you know, outside of election time, and they're not that interested in what the leader of the opposition's got to say 3 years out of an election. So I think sometimes in the Westminster bubble we sort of focus kind of very strongly on the ins and outs, who's in, who's out, who's departed from the shadow cabinet. I think the truth is very little of this will be piercing the public perception.
Now, but what about all the dissent? We just heard some from Len McCluskey, we heard it from John McDonnell on the programme earlier, and we got this article from Jeremy Corbyn, saying that Sir Keir Starmer is propping up the rich. I mean, is that really true?
Well, no, I don't think it's true, but it's the kind of thing that Keir Starmer won't be able to ignore, because this still accounts for a large percentage of his party membership. Jeremy Corbyn commands huge support. There was a rather awkward moment for Sir Keir either yesterday or the day before that, where one of the speakers was saying, what was the moment that you first felt enthused by the Labour Party, the moment that you first joined? And there was a huge chorus of, oh, Jeremy Corbyn from the audience. So it's not something that can simply be ignored. And that level of dissent is, it's been going on for quite some time. But I suppose the lesson will be how much is Keir Starmer able to contain those elements? And I think we have seen quite a bit of this in the last few days with the fallout from Angela Rayner's remarks. Perhaps, I think if he was more in control of the party, he might have been able to extract an apology from Angela Rayner, but instead she kind of doubled down, which made Keir Starmer look weak.
What do you think? I mean, those elements, the Corbynite elements, if we want to call them that.
Yeah,
I mean, are they fading or are they?
I think there will always be that strong tradition in Labour. There kind of always has been. It's stronger now than it was pre-Jeremy Corbyn, because Jeremy Corbyn was leader of the party for that period of time. But there's always been dissent on the left of the Labour Party. It was, again, there's a bit of it was ever thus about it. I think it's quite funny reading this piece, though, because basically what Jeremy Corbyn says is Keir Starmer needs to adopt my general election slogan from 2019, like Labour's for the many, not the few. He's not doing enough to attack the power of the few. It didn't work in 2019. And actually, I think what public attitudes work shows is that idea of being against the few. People don't really like it, because people tend to believe that most people in the few, they might have wealth, for example, it's because they deserve it. So I don't think that divisive sort of sloganeering works, really. That's obviously not going to say stop Jeremy Corbyn writing a piece recommending it.
Now, what about the shortages, obviously led by fuel, but also empty supermarket shelves? We've got Hugo Rifkind and Gabby Hinsted both basically saying that the government's kind of line of, well, it's your fault, for panic buying and only half fill your car up when you go to the petrol station, which I have to say strikes me as moronic advice. That the government's just getting the whole tone of this wrong.
Yeah, they both talk about that, and they talk about how, I think another point they both make is that they both see that some kind of unstable government leads to a sense of panic and insecurity amongst the general public that leads them to do things like panic buying and so on, which I have some sympathy with. But I do wonder if both of these arguments slightly miss the point that panic buying has actually been a feature of all sorts of situations across British history with different kinds of governments in charge, whereas I think both seem to assert that it's a kind of panicky populist government that has led to people feeling this insecurity. And I guess also Hugo Rifkind, I think, uses the words populist tub thumping about this government. But I guess you might argue that another part of the puzzle that he doesn't really mention in his piece is the fact that in moving strongly towards green energy and away from domestic sources of greenhouse gas, that's not really a populist thing to do, but it has certainly led to perhaps part of the crisis.
Even if they're getting it wrong, Sonia, I mean, the fact is that the Conservatives are still ahead in the polls.
Yeah, that's right, and that's probably not going to change anytime soon, I would have thought. So, and not on the basis of what's been happening at this conference. But I think we've got a long way to go until the next general election. So to make predictions now about what's going to be happening in 2 or 3 years, particularly given the level of change we're going to see economically, I think times, sadly, are going to be feeling quite grim for people in about a year, with the universal credit cut, with fuel prices going up, housing costs are really, really high. So I think things aren't going to be feeling too rosy, and it's not clear yet what that's going to do to stop political sentiment.
We shall see. Thank you both very much indeed.